ever find that God has provided for you, has led you, has guided you many, many times in many, many different ways, and yet you find yourself in a new situation, something happens unexpectedly, a trial comes your way, and suddenly you find yourself questioning God? Does it ever seem like one moment you're riding high and life is going well and you're trusting God and you're blessing God, and then the next moment you find yourself filled with fear, running from what you know is right, and maybe not disobeying so much as ignoring or not thinking about what God would want in this situation, until eventually you find yourself in a mess and realize, no, I was disobeying. That seems to sadly be the case in many believers' life, and probably most of our lives, that we're up and down. It's sometimes maddening to read the account of the children of Israel as they're wandering around in the desert, and God provides for them, and then a new challenge arises, and they immediately forget God's previous work, and they begin complaining, and they begin crying out, and they begin accusing God. And again, it's easy to look at that and to think, I can't believe they would do that. And yet the truth is, if we're going to be honest, we do the same. As we come to the life of Abraham, we're going to be looking this time at the second half of, the remainder of chapter 12. In our previous lesson, we looked only at the first 3 verses. Now we're going to look at the rest of the chapter. And what we're going to find is that Abram starts off really, really well. I mean, he's just doing an exceptional job of following God and obeying God, and he's seeing God's blessing on his life. And then a trial hits him, perhaps unexpectedly, probably unexpectedly. And it really throws Abram. And next thing we know, he's leaving the land God had given him. Next thing we know, he's lying and abandoning his wife. And other people are paying the price. And the whole thing is just a real big mess. And so as we look at that, it's tempting to ask, what went wrong here? And the reality is, we have to keep showing faith at the high points and at the low points. And Abram started off really well in this chapter, and he ended up not doing so well. Not so much that he's discounted and we'll forget him and nothing's ever going to happen, that God's never going to use him anymore, but enough that it ought to make us pause and realize that even a person of faith is capable of falling. And so we're going to look at both of these. We're going to look at the high point that Abram reaches, and then we're also going to look at some of the mistakes that he made and draw a practical application personally for what that means for us. So we see here, first of all, that Abram journeys in the promised land. And one of the questions there at the very beginning, it says, what examples do you see of true faith in these verses? This is one of the observed questions, and I wish that there were more of these. I'm trying, as I continue writing series, to include more and more of these, because this is one of the great benefits of doing a small group Bible study, is especially for believers who aren't as familiar with how to study their Bible. This is a really great way to teach them and to kind of hold their hand and guide them along so that they see what Bible study looks like. This is one of those areas where, and I'll do this sometimes, where I'm basically trying to get people to guess the outline. Sometimes I'll tell them that, sometimes I won't. But a question like this, I'm essentially asking, what are the examples of faith? Well, we're going to see that here, that true faith obeys immediately, true faith sacrifices blessings, true faith worships God, and true faith must be ready for trials. And so there's several different examples of faith, but it's good to get people to kind of be reading through it and skimming it, and on their own coming to conclusions on, oh, this looks like faith, and this looks like faith. And so that's a great question to ask. The more you can get people just reading the text and seeking to answer questions on their own, the better. In fact, good Bible study really comes down to asking good questions of God's Word. And if you can ask good questions, ask thoughtful questions, that can be a real help. So, what do we have here? Well, verses 4 through 9, we see Abram's journey in the promised land. And again, we'll see, first of all, that true faith obeys immediately. Now, I go into a little bit more detail about that footnote that I had done earlier in our previous lesson about did Abram obey immediately? And here I am kind of making a point about that, okay? It is a point in the outline that Abram obeys immediately. And so there's a little bit more detail. And again, theologians will argue over whether the call of God in Genesis 12:1-3 is a second call, or if it's supposed to refer back to an earlier time. Later in the story, in Genesis 15:7, we're going to read that the Lord called Abram while he was in Ur. And so I'll just go ahead and read that briefly. Genesis 15 and verse 7 reads, "And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it." And then later on in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, we also read that God called to Abraham specifically when he was in Ur. And so Acts chapter 7, verse 2, it says, speaking of Stephen, "And he said, Men, brethren, and fathers, hearken. The God of glory appeared unto our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he dwelt in Haran." Okay, Mesopotamia is where Ur is located, and so it's very clear there from those passages that God appeared to Abram, and he called him out of Ur. Now, that raises questions because God tells him to leave his family behind and his father's house and his kindred, and yet Terah goes with Abram into Haran, and then Abram is in Terah for a while, and then he leaves. And so again, that raises the question. Some would say the opposite of what I'm saying here, that Abram is a bad example of faith because he doesn't obey immediately. And yet there you have it, chapter 12, verse 4, true faith obeys immediately. And so I do explain this a little bit more in this lesson. It's hard to know for sure whether this is a second call or whether God is or whether the author of Genesis is simply pulling back that first call and bringing it forward. But in either case, it seems like it would appear that this story is organized to highlight Abram's obedience. And as we look throughout the life of Abram, we're going to see this pattern again and again. When God speaks, when God tells Abram to do something, Abram does it right away. Many people plan on obeying God, but simply never get around to it. Immediate obedience is so crucial and so important. If God puts something on your heart, obey. If God speaks to you, say yes. And there's some good questions there to ask. Why is immediate obedience hard for us? And what happens if we believe God, but then we decide, but I'm going to do that later? We see, secondly, that true faith sacrifices blessing. And this, I think, is really, really important to realize, that when Abram leaves Haran, he is leaving a place of God's blessing. Sometimes God calls us to leave behind the blessings that he has given us so that we can move forward in faith. And yet, as twisted as it might seem, sometimes the biggest barrier to stepping out in faith is actually the blessings that God has already given us. So God may have given you wonderful things, a family, a home, a job, great opportunities. And yet there may come a day when God asks you to give those things up, to trust him, and to put those in his hands. Sadly, there are many examples of people who were not able to give up the blessings that God had for God. This account of the rich young ruler probably comes to mind almost immediately. Somebody who didn't want to give up the blessings that God had given him. And yet in Abram, that's exactly what we see. That he is, let's see here, it's in verse 5, it says that he took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son and all the substance that they had gathered and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot there. God has been blessing Abram, and then God tells Abraham, all right, it's time to move, and Abram obeys. And he does it at 75. I would imagine he was probably pretty well established at that point. And yet Abram obeys God, and he moves. And then we see next that true faith worships God. Verses 6 through 8, it's kind of interesting. There's an account of Abram moving around in the land of Canaan. It says, and Abram passed through the land unto the places of Sichem, unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram, and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. So God appeared, and Abram built an altar. And he removed thence unto a mountain on the east side of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. So, we get this account. Abram's moving around in the land, and wherever he goes, he's building an altar and he's calling out to God. He's worshiping God. He's praising God. Obviously, in the 21st century, we're not building altars. But we, like Abraham, ought to make worship a priority. Everywhere he went, Abram made sure that there was an altar whereby he could worship God and whereby he could call out to God. And that's a great example for us as well. And so true faith, we see, worships God. And then we go on and we see that true faith must be ready for trials. Now this one's a little bit sad. It says in verse 9, and Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. And this next phrase, it ought to jolt us a little bit. Because God has called Abram to give up blessings, and Abram's done that. God has called Abram to go into a land that he would show him later, and Abram did that. And God said, congratulations, you're here. I'm going to give this land to you. And Abram's worshiping God. And everything seems to be going well. And then we read the beginning of verse 10. It says, and there was a famine in the land. How unexpected. I think sometimes trials shake us because they're so unexpected. It seems like everything's going well. We're doing exactly what God has asked us to do. As best as we know, we're being faithful, we're obeying, God is pleased. Maybe there's even spiritual growth, and then seemingly out of nowhere, tragedy strikes. Problems arise. And sometimes that's enough to knock us off kilter so that we immediately get into problem fix-it mode and we forget about God. And that's exactly what's going to happen with Abram. He's got a problem, and he falls immediately into fix-it mode. Okay, what am I going to do? And this means, this one's kind of a negative. The other three, we see examples of Abram doing this. This last one, we don't see Abram do it. But true faith must be ready for trials. I like what the Apostle Peter said when he said, brethren, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as if some strange thing happened. And that happens, doesn't it? We follow God and we somehow think that because we're being obedient that problems just aren't going to materialize. And yet, what does Peter say? What do we see in the life of even very, very faithful people? We see that trials are going to come. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. We shouldn't be taken off guard by that. We should actually have an appropriate level of readiness for that. Okay, Lord, I'm following you and things are going well, and I thank you for that. And I realize that tomorrow the bottom could fall out from my life, and in one moment, everything that I think and know could be totally changed forever. And I'm ready to trust you for that as much as I'm able. And I'm trusting you for that grace, and I'm preparing my heart now to seek you in the midst of that tragedy. And so true faith must be ready for trials. Now, we go on and we see here that Abram was not ready for trials, and so he heads down to Egypt, and that's the second part of the chapter. First part of the chapter, God calls to Abram, and Abram obeys. Second part of the chapter, a trial hits, and Abram immediately starts spinning, trying to figure out what he's going to do about this situation. Now, the first point to note is that Abram failed to inquire of God. And there's a question that's worth asking here, and maybe even you want to ask it before you fill in that blank or get to that point in the outline. And that question is this: should Abram have moved to Egypt? And I think that's a great question to just open up to the group and get people discussing. See if you can find someone to say yes and find someone to say no, and put a $5 table in the middle and say, all right, go at it. Whoever wins gets that money. No, I'm kidding, obviously. But have a little bit of a back and forth here. And a lot of times we do Bible studies and we're kind of waiting for people to say, okay, what's the right answer? And with this one, it's a little bit challenging. Should Abram have gone down? There's some that will say, no, he shouldn't have. The land of Canaan, that was the land that God gave him. And for him to go down was a lack of faith. Others will say, well, there's food there. We don't. It's hard for us to judge because we don't know what exactly the famine meant. How bad was the famine? Does Abraham have half his flocks dying? Okay, it's real easy to be kind of the armchair quarterback and say, oh, Abram shouldn't have done that. He should have trusted God. It's another thing when people are dying around you and there's a place where there's food that you could go. But I think all of that is important to realize this. Ultimately, we don't know what Abram was supposed to do because we never hear from God. And it's interesting that in this entire section, we don't hear about God at all. And that's kind of the point to begin with, is that Abram didn't necessarily think to himself, I'm going to rebel against God. I'm going to disobey what he said. I'm going to forsake him. He's forsaken me. I don't think that's what's going through Abram's head at this point. I think what's going through his head is, boom, there's a new problem. Okay, how do I fix that problem? What do we got to do? Well, people don't have food. We need food. Okay, where can we go to get food? Okay, Egypt's got food. Let's go down to Egypt. And then on the way down to Egypt, he's like, oh, okay, another problem. I've got a really beautiful wife, and this is kind of, I'm walking into this country, and people there, I don't know what they're like. What if they just kill me and take my wife? That could happen. Okay, so how do we fix that problem? Well, let's just, for the sake of safety, let's just tell them she's my sister. We're going to find out later that's half true. All of these things are going through Abram's mind. And I don't think it's so much that Abram is saying, God, I don't care about what you have to say. You failed me. I'm going to figure this out. I think Abram just got into go mode. And because he got into go mode, he was trying to solve the problem, and he wasn't bringing God into the picture. And so this whole account we have is all the wisdom of Abram, and it all blows up in his face. So Abram failed to inquire of God. Next, we see that Abram failed to trust God. And those two kind of go together, right? If I don't ask God what I should do, I'm not going to be thinking about God, and I'm not going to be trusting God. As I said, going through this story, God just totally disappears from the picture. He's in the background. Nobody hears from him. It's pretty hard to admit sometimes that we have not been following God, and we need to get back to humbly trusting him. And that's one of the questions here. I think that's a great question to ask. Why is it? And there's lots of factors. There's pride. There's sometimes pretty big steps that may need to be taken to get back onto the path that we know God would want us on. And there's our own flesh that resists. There's Satan, which is trying to keep us away from that. And so sometimes what happens is it starts off not really thinking about God. And maybe it's subconscious or even semi-conscious. We're like, I've got this. And if you're like me, sometimes it slowly becomes more and more conscious. And eventually you realize I'm going my own path. I'm following my own wisdom. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, trust in the Lord with all thine heart and lean not into thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. And sometimes you just realize partway through, I'm not trusting God and he's not directing my path. I'm leaning on my own wisdom. And what do we do when that happens? Well, hopefully, as soon as we realize that, we come to God in brokenness and repentance, and we ask him to lead and guide and direct us moving forward. And if we don't, if we continue to follow our own path, as Abram does here, what we're going to find is that we actually will hurt those around us. Verse 17 here, it says, And the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now, it's interesting because in the beginning of this chapter, Abram is told, you are going to be a blessing to the nations. Through your offspring, all of the nations will be blessed. And yet here we have the first account of Abram interacting with another nation, and it doesn't go well for them. And you know what? Similarly in our lives, if we don't trust God, if we follow our own wisdom, it's going to impact other people. And so we see here that Abram does not follow God, and because of that, other people get hurt. And then finally, Abram failed to glorify God. It's pretty sad to hear the ending of this account of Abraham and Egypt. Pharaoh calls to Abram and says, What is this that thou hast done? Why didst thou not tell that she was my wife? Kind of rapid fire questions there. He keeps going though. Why saidst thou she is my sister? So I might have taken her to me to wife. Now therefore, behold thy wife, take her and go thy way. Just rapid fire questions. Why did you do this? Why did you do this? Why did you do this? Get out of here. And when we live by our own wisdom, yes, other people get hurt, but also God's glory is hurt. Pharaoh doesn't come out of this with a very big view of Abraham or his God for that matter. And that's sad because Abram was not able to be the testimony for God that he could have been and that he should have been, because instead he was leaning on his own wisdom and his own understanding. Later in Abram's life, we're going to see the opposite. We're going to see people look at him, particularly when we get to Abimelech and the Hittites. They're going to look at him and they're going to say, God is blessing this man. But not here. Not here. Abram's trusting his own wisdom, and it blows up in his face. And so this is, I think, there's so many lessons in this series that I really love, but this is certainly one of them because I think it's so relatable to our lives, isn't it? Where we find ourselves trusting in our own wisdom and going our own way. And sometimes we almost don't expect it. But before we know it, things are blowing up in our face and we step back and we realize, I was trusting in me. I wasn't trusting in God. And so it's a warning. It's an example of what faith looks like, following God immediately and worshiping Him and obeying Him. That's wonderful. But it's also a warning that we can go very quickly from the mountaintop to the valley. It happens fast. And that's a warning that we all should take to heart. And yet, there's hope. And the hope is our next lesson. Because in our next lesson, we see Abram walking out of Egypt, humiliated, tail between his legs, pretty embarrassing. And we see that he immediately gets back up, gets back in the saddle, and keeps living a life of faith. And so, if you're teaching this lesson and you realize, man, I haven't been living a life of faith, or as you're encouraging the people at your small group or wherever you might be sharing this lesson, end on a positive note. And that positive note is this. Yeah, you've screwed up, you've made a mistake, but part of the life of faith is recognizing our errors, getting back up, and continuing to trust God and going back to trusting God even when we've fallen away. And what we will find every time is that we serve a good God who's willing to accept us and to have us back as we continue to live that life of faith.